deconstructed these walls and I found a business.
Welcome to the Deconstructionist Podcast. I'm your host, John Williamson, and we're back with part 2 of my interview with Carrie Sheffield. Before we get to that, just a couple quick updates. First of all, thank you guys for all being very, very patient. It was about a month between episodes. That was not planned. It was on the calendar to continue weekly, and then I was in the midst of a move, moving to a new house and setting up a new recording studio, and that took longer than I anticipated. And then right immediately after that, I got COVID again. So so feeling way better now. I still sound a little bit under the weather, but I feel great. Feel much better, and so hopefully there will be no more stops until the end of season 12 here. And then again, like I said, we'll take a probably shorter break than we had intended before we launch into the end of the year and finish up the end of the year. But for now, this is part 2. Hopefully you enjoyed the first part. If you haven't listened to it yet, pause, go back, listen to that part first. But Carrie Sheffield was super fun interview and just an absolutely fascinating story of just someone who overcame like a number of obstacles to be the success that she is today. So she is a columnist and broadcaster in Washington, D.C. The book that she just released is a best-selling book called Motorhome Prophesies, A Journey of Healing and Forgiveness. That just came out. Fascinating book. Absolutely fantastic read. Check it out. You've probably seen her. She's been all over the news. She's been on numerous different channels and has published in all sorts of different publications as well, from the Wall Street Journal, Time Magazine, USA Today, CNN Opinion, the New York Times, Washington Post, CNBC, National Review, the DC Examiner, Newsweek, HuffPost, and Daily Caller. As well as numerous others. So she's been all over the place. She's been on Fox News, Newsmax TV, Fox Business Network, MSNBC, CNN, PBS, and BBC. She worked as a White House correspondent for a time, and is just obviously, as you can see in her bio, quite prolific. So super kind and fun interview. So hopefully you guys enjoy the second part of this. In the meanwhile, check out the website. We did have a slight update. So unfortunately, there's some confusion with the renewal and lost the domain name. So if you go to .com, you're going to notice some weird, I don't know what's going on in there, but we secured .org. So same website with just .org at the end. If you go to any of our Linktree links that are in the bios of all of our social media, it'll take you straight to the new website. It's just thedeconstructionist.org now. Able to save the entire website, though. So all of the content that was on the old website is on the new one, including all of our blogs, links to our social media, links to our Patreon, our web store, which now has international shipping and different options available. As well as for free, you can stream any of our back catalog of episodes through the website. So I'll be updating that today, in fact. So go check it out. Otherwise, enjoy the second part of this episode. We'll be back next week with a brand new guest. And until then, I give you Carrie freaking Sheffield.
We built a church on certainty that fears everything against it.
It's funny. I'm not at all surprised by that data. Because at the core, one of the main focal points of like the 12-step programs that they use for AA is believing in a power greater than yourself, and sort of, and part of that too kind of leads back to you were talking about anxiety. I remember my therapist saying at one point, anxiety, often stems from trying to control that which you can't control, and once you let go of that, the letting go, the act of letting go is part of kind of like relieving that stress or that anxiety. And then the other piece of it too is just like the thing that we've talked about since the very beginning of this podcast is I cannot emphasize this enough, but the importance of community, like whatever that looks like, and everything that comes along with being a part of a community, someone there, to lend an ear, or just say, I'm sorry, that sucks, and give you a hug, or hold you accountable. Sometimes you need to be held accountable, but there's so much positivity that comes out of being a part of a community. And, just the fact that human beings, are not meant to be isolated. We're communal. by nature. So I'm not surprised at all by any of that data.
Yeah, and what's interesting is that the community, you can, because we've seen people like Richard Dawkins recently, the atheist, saying like, I consider myself now a cultural Christian, but I'm still atheist, because I respect Christian culture, and I don't want to live under the barbarian Muslims. I respect Christendom. It's like, dude, you've spent decades trying to destroy Christendom. I appreciate that you've seen the light now, at least on the fruits of it. But here's the thing: you can't take the fruit without the tree. Like it doesn't just, you can't have, I mean, yes, you can have close community around other things like a polo club or a yacht club. You can have community around these things, but they will not be the same level of rootedness and depth that comes in Christ. And you can say, and I say this as a recovered agnostic, because I used to, when I was going through this journey, I actually went through that phase. I went through that Richard Dawkins phase where I was like, even if it's not true, I like what they're doing, and I don't like the alternative. And when I hang out with people who are not rooted, I find myself feeling worse. So I like this feeling I get when I'm in this specific community. So I don't care if Jesus was actually divine or not. I like the trappings of it, and it's interesting because I think that that's a better in between than hating it and wanting to destroy it. So at least you admire it. But
Yeah.
I say, let's take it a step further and say, you can't just, nothing comes out of a vacuum.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's interesting too, to your point, like when you talk to people who aren't even Christian and you boil it down to, and you discuss the teachings of Jesus, like, and everything that Jesus stood for, even atheists have to admit, like, yeah, that kind of makes sense, like that, he had some good stuff to say there. I think, we should probably love one another, and we should probably take care of the poor and the sick and the widows. It's like there aren't too many people out there who would argue against that, which is kind of the interesting part of it.
I spoke at Yale about my book. I was invited by a student group, and the student group loved everything I had to say. There was a professor who came who wasn't part of the original invite group per se. He hated my Christian background because he said Hitler was a Christian. And I was like, no, he wasn't. Like,
that's debatable.
like, you're a Yale professor. Like, read what he was trying to use Christianity as a political tool.
Yeah.
And he would do that publicly. But privately, he thought it was stupid. And he hated that Jesus was a Jew. He also hated the mythology of it. I did some research on this actually after he made these claims. It turns out that Goebbels, the advisor to Hitler, wrote in his private journal, the Fuhrer hates Christianity because he thinks the mythology and the iconography is dark and depressing and just like soul crushing, like the cathedrals he thinks are dark and dank. And he prefers the architecture and the temples of the Greco-Roman, Zeus, and that he's positive and smiling and bright. He thinks that it's bright. I'm just like, okay, Hitler obviously just cared about the iconography of it. He didn't actually, again, he's like Richard Dawkins. He just sees the superficial nature of it versus, wow. And also Hitler, like, he just didn't like that Jesus dies. Like, he thinks that's a loser, It's like, well, yeah, and then he was resurrected. You're kind of missing that part, but even that you're a God who is being beaten and killed by his creation, that kind of sucks. It's not like him. He would never do that. Like, he wanted people to basically worship him and idolize him.
Yeah, it's definitely somebody who doesn't know their history very well if they think that's the case. Like, and it's kind of ironic also that Hitler was like, this is too depressing, but like murdering millions of people isn't, but that's a whole nother conversation.
Very good
point. Yeah. So, you talked about like all of this adversity that you had to overcome en route to becoming a Harvard professor. And so, looking back now, current state, I'm assuming at least some of your siblings kind of followed suit, as kind of followed you blazed the trail. Did any of them also sort of see the light, so to speak, and find their way out of it? I know you mentioned there's some of your brothers that did not. So what current state, like where does your family sit when it comes to this?
Yeah. And just, I'm not a Harvard professor. I just got a Harvard master's. So that's all. Just quick little note. But um, I put a note in the book that, I do not, I don't go in depth with profiling my siblings in some respects, because I want to respect their privacy. And the editor who looked at my manuscript the first time, she's like, your siblings aren't really big characters. I'm like, that's by design for their own protection. Like they have the right to tell their own stories, and I do talk about the impact that this upbringing had on us, because it's illustrative. That's why I'm doing it, and to help people. But one of my brothers is Christian. He got baptized a couple years after I did, and so we've been supporting each other, which is great. And a couple other siblings who have done a Catholic walk. So my brother's Protestant as well, the one I mentioned. We're all at different kind of phases and different ebbs and flows, but we've all struggled with our mental health. And that's where I think siblings, I'm sure everybody here who has a sibling, how they know how to push your buttons and vice versa. And so, and it's been ebbs and flows. Like I would have a favorite brother and then another favorite brother. Since I've got 5 of them, it would change, and I've been there for them and they've been there for me. I had, a couple different times I talked about how my 2 separate sisters separately at different times were there for me when I was feeling suicidal. And I appreciate that, and I think the trauma response, knowing how to push someone's buttons and vice versa, it can be hard to unwire that default and to feel like the sibling actually loves me versus I'm in competition with them. Or because that's one other thing of the cult stuff, is that you turn yourself, turning the members on each other, so that there's not actually a deep love for each other. You're actually kind of hating each other, because ultimately cults are founded on hate. And the cult leader ultimately both hates themselves, but also because narcissists actually do hate themselves. They don't know it, but they actually do, because that's why they behave. Because if they're so insecure that they don't realize how much they actually hate themselves, and they control and abuse and do all kinds of other coping mechanisms to try to feel loved, because they hate themselves. And so that programming was passed to all of us. So feeling suicidal is ultimately self-hatred. And so it's hard to know how to talk to someone, especially since I've been verbally abusive of siblings and they've been verbally abusive of me. How do you go to a new phase? And so I've actually offered to pay for family therapy for a couple of my siblings, so that we can have conversations with the therapist neutrally. I would let them pick it and I would pay for it. And unfortunately, they haven't taken me up on that. So the door is open.
Yeah, that's a remarkable offer to make. Yeah, and it's unfortunate. Like, we're such huge advocates here for therapy and taking care of yourself mentally. I myself, have dealt with depression over the years, and it's funny to look back, even 6 years ago. I remember when I first went on antidepressants, and I remember it was like I was going to a small group with the church I was going to at the time, and it took me 3 or 4 weeks to even get the guts to tell them, and I'm like, it seems so silly now because I'll tell anybody, I don't care. I'm like, yeah, sometimes drugs are necessary, like to regulate. Sometimes your body just doesn't produce enough serotonin or whatever, kind of like if your body doesn't produce enough insulin, you might need some medication for that. No different here, and so like, I'll tell anybody now, like, hey, if you need it, you need it. And trust me, you'll feel infinitely better and you'll never look back. But back then it was impossible to even admit that I had the underlying condition that needed to be treated. And I feel like a lot of people probably were raised in that way, where especially within guys. I know you mentioned earlier that the disparity between men and women, like we're like from the male side, it's like generations of just suppressing your feelings and not talking about it. It took me years of therapy to even be able to talk about my feelings. I used to annoy my therapist because she'd say, "How are you feeling?" I'm like, "Annoyed." She goes, "Okay, that's a surface feeling. What's making you annoyed?" I'm like, "I don't know." So it's so I get it. And therapy is hard. It's uncomfortable often. It's painful. But my God, is it so worth it? After you work, grin and bear it and kind of work through it. So yeah, what a double-edged sword that like you've got family members who, um, you know, eh, like are the only ones who can identify with what you've experienced because they were there as well. But on the flip side, also know how to, as you said, trigger, that response. So that's, I can't even imagine. So talk a little bit about ultimately, you mentioned this a little bit at the top, but I'd love for you to talk a little bit more about your hope for this book, because obviously you have a goal in mind, and you've already sort of seen the fruits of some of that with the response that you've gotten initially. But ultimately, what is your hope for this book?
Yeah, my hope for the book is that it can help lead people to know more who God is. I talk a lot about a book by Tim Keller named Counterfeit Gods, and each chapter is a counterfeit God that we use in place, that we worship the created instead of the creator. And so my goal with the book is to help people understand through my walk, and maybe see some reflection in their walk, how God, a major theme that I have in the book is that God is not religion. So that even if you've had church hurt or some type of religious abuse, I do believe that's no coincidence why Gen Z is the most anxious and depressed generation. Usually in sociology or demography, like the older generation is suicidal because they're in a lot of physical pain and they're ready to die, and they have higher suicide. And the fact that Gen Z is like young people and they are feeling suicidal, that is a huge red flag. And to me, it's no coincidence that they're also the most unchurched. They're the most un-Christian generation that this country has seen in more than 200 years, almost 250 years. So this is a sociological experiment that America has never tried before. I mean, it really started in the 1960s when you had the massive upheaval and the assault on our Judeo-Christian heritage. But the thing is, I wrestle with that in the book because I agree that there were evil things done in the Judeo-Christian heritage using God's name falsely. And so we need to repent and acknowledge those things, but also acknowledge that's not the end of the story. And so that's why you can't. So Richard Dawkins, it's interesting because he's over there in Europe, which is far more secular than we are. And it's like they're 20, 30 years ahead. He doesn't like what he's dealing with. I don't want to be in that place either. So my hope in this book is to help our country, yes, be honest and truthful about the evil done in the name of Christ and in the name of God. I had evil spoken of over me in the name of Christ. I had a curse put on me in the name of Christ. That's evil. And we have to acknowledge that, and to acknowledge that it hurts people and that it causes them to hate God because you're using his name wrongly. And I like to say I heard a pastor on Instagram, and I didn't should have clipped who it was. I don't want to steal his line, but it's a great line. And it is that if you hear Beethoven's Ninth Symphony played horribly, you don't blame Beethoven, you blame the musicians. So
It's really
that's
good.
a horrible Christian who abuses you. Don't blame Jesus.
That's such a good way to put it. If you find out who that was, let me know. That's really good. Um, yeah, and I think it's there. I don't think there's any question as to some of the causes behind the rise in suicide amongst this generation. I mean, it feels like a sort of lost generation trying to find its footing and figure out who they are, on top of all of these other societal pressures placed on them right now. And then on top of that, you can't even afford to buy a house anymore. So it's like, it's unbelievable. And I would argue that there are more pressures placed on this generation than any prior generation in the history of America at this point. So, if at some point we can continue to make therapy normalize therapy and normalize mental health and make it accessible and affordable, I think we'd be moving in the right direction.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I think there are some Christians who, they might have actually judged you for using medication or judged you. I mean, the reason you felt reticent is because it's very rational, because a lot of people, Christians, they say, well, just pray harder. Oh yeah, you're not righteous enough. Like you just need Jesus more. Like, okay, but what does that actually mean? And Kurt Thompson, if you guys aren't familiar with him, he's fantastic. He's a really well-known therapist who's Christian, and he studied neuroscience and the neurobiology. Like you said, it is a chemical and physical thing. And that's the first time I went to therapy. It was actually a Mormon bishop at the time, because I was a BYU student. And he said, if you had a broken leg, you wouldn't think twice about getting a cast. Or if you had chemo, you wouldn't think twice about, I'm sorry, if you had cancer, you wouldn't think twice about going and getting chemo. So it's a physical problem. And so I've been on antidepressants a couple times in my life. I'm off of them now. Like I'm able to, through exercise and eating well, getting good sleep, mitigating stress, I'm able to live without needing medication. But I do go to therapy regularly, and I'm very active in spiritual community, because that's where the neuroplasticity of your brain, the physical cognitive behavior, is a manifestation of the emotions that you speak through therapy. And so therapy is not just for wimps lying on a couch crying about their problems. It's actually a physical treatment. It's basically like, again, nobody would think twice if you're going into physical therapy. This is physical therapy for your brain. It's creating new neuroplastic synapse of firing and wiring patterns. That's what it is. It is physical therapy. Therapy is physical therapy. I should make that bumper sticker.
Yes. It's so funny. It makes me think of, I can't tell you how many times somebody said to me, I've been thinking about going to therapy. Well, don't think about it. Go. Like, if you're thinking about it, what's the harm in trying it? You know what I mean? Like,
yeah, I will say, you make sure that you might need to, not all the time, but you might need to therapist shop. And yes, as a believer, you
absolutely.
might. For me, I prefer having believers. I had a really great Jewish therapist. I have a really great Christian therapist now. I still talk to Jewish ones sometimes too. Like and it was in New York. But I moved down here, and she's in Virginia. But I've tried some terrible ones. I had one who, I swear, it was like she was trying to make me codependent on her. And I was like, I would feel worse after leaving her office, which is not how you should feel. So I think when you're going through severe trauma, things like divorce, child abuse, or chemical imbalances that leave you physically unable to do what you need, then going to therapy is wonderful. But you can get a lot of the same benefits from a small group. That's really what's interesting, is this notion that therapy is a new, it's a modern thing. It's actually just kind of applying things that we've known all along, and that a lot of clergy have played that role in a lot of respects of, the confession booth. That's like a therapy room.
Yeah.
And so I also read a book that really transformed, and I talk about in the book, transformed my life. It was a book by a guy named Donald Robertson. He's a therapist, and he also has a background in Stoic philosophy and understanding the Stoicism and the classics and Greco-Roman philosophy. And his book is about the cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, which I think is probably the most effective school of therapy in my view. It is rooted, the people who founded it are actually, they explicitly said, we're we're rooting our tactics in Stoicism, which was an ancient Roman school of philosophy, Greco-Roman, and it was created to train young men on how to be virtuous leaders and good rulers. So it's like the elite young men were sent to these philosophy schools to learn Stoicism. So it's the same ideas. And like the Bible says, there's nothing new under the sun. So for therapy, it's like, okay, we'll just do what's already been done for thousands of years. It's just it's just got maybe a few new words.
Yeah, absolutely. I love it. Well, thank you so much for spending some time with me today. Before I let you go, where can people stay up on top of what you're up to and get a copy of the book?
Yeah, so I've got a Substack. That's probably the easiest place. I do monthly updates on there. And that's for the free newsletter. If you do paid, we have more regular updates as well. And again, here's the book, Motorhome Prophecies. It's on Amazon, and you can get it. If you prefer local bookstores, call your local bookstore and ask them if they don't have it on the shelf to order it for you. And I'm on all the social media platforms, the big ones, and look forward to connecting.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We'll have the links in the show notes, so go check it out. Go grab a copy of the book. Thank you so much for spending some time with me today.
Thank you, John. God bless.
The foundation we laid, no church. Tell me what made us think that we could keep others away in the name of some so-called safety. 'Cause we sold our souls for a little bit of power and control, and we left a hole, and those were called to love. Oh, church, what have we done? No church. When will we ever see? Until we're all treated the same, that nobody is actually free. Oh, church. Started to pave the way to our irrelevancy, 'cause we've driven the other away. 'Cause we sold our soul for a little bit of power and control, and we left a hole, and those were called to love. I guess they're not enough. Oh, church, what have we done? But there is hope, somewhere to go, someone to feed, someone to lead, someone to clothe. And who are we if not redeemed? Bringers of peace and justice, sweet and holy love. Oh, church, what have we done? No, church, what have we done? May we sell our souls to be rid of all the power Church, let that be us.
Morning people wake up for peace and quiet. McDonald's breakfast people, we wake up for the sweet rush of getting that warm, delicious breakfast right before it ends.
Crush your morning goals with a steak, egg, and cheese bagel or any breakfast sandwich and snag another one for just $1 with the buy one, get one deal. Only in the McDonald's app. Limited time only at participating McDonald's. Valid once per day. Must opt into rewards.
Ba-da-ba-ba-ba.